Hi everyone, and welcome back to the BrainTrainr Podcast. I am Lindsay from the BrainTrainr team, and today's episode is one you don't want to miss. We are joined by Victor Beausoleil, visionary leader, author, and founder of SETSI, the social economic through social inclusion. Victor brings 2 decades of experience challenging extractive systems and building pathways toward justice, equity, and digital inclusion. In this conversation, we explore the true cost of AI, not just in dollars, but in human and environmental impact, and how communities can reclaim power through humility, collaboration, and ancestral knowledge. It's a deep, inspired talk about what it really means to build technology that serves people and the planet. So, all right, let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of the BrainTrainr Podcast. I'm so excited today because we have a guest that, as I told Victor, I've been trying to have since the podcast started. So we finally haven't pinned down here. It's not easy because he's not, Alex and I were in Toronto, and Victor, you are in Ghana, right? Yes? Okay. And I think that's like 4 or 5 hours difference or something like that.
Yeah, indeed.
So very pleased to have him today. Victor is a change maker, is like a superhero. He will tell you himself what kind of superhero maybe we can say. But yeah, he's co-authored many books, lecture across continents. He's a proud father of 4. Victor brings a systems lens, heart-centered focus into everything he touches. So welcome to the show, and give it up to Alex to get started.
It's such a pleasure, Victor. Like obviously we worked together for quite a long time, but it's nice to sit across from you, even though it's virtually, and kind of dig in a little bit deeper. Usually we like to start off. We're both fans of personal journeys and why people do what they do, what led them to this. So to start off with, could you talk about kind of like the journey that you've taken? And obviously you wear a lot of different hats and a lot of different work around systems change, transformation, social justice. But as we're talking about AI, can you talk about your journey to the focus area that you have on AI now and what frame that you're coming in with?
Absolutely. So once again, I'm grateful to both of you for creating this platform for remarkable thought leaders and practitioners to come to share, to build. My name is Victor Beausoleil, husband, father of 4. I give thanks as always to the original stewards of the various lands we're on. I give thanks to all my ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation, all those whose bones lie at the bottom of the transatlantic, who said freedom or death. I give thanks to all my elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. In terms of your question, when I think about artificial intelligence, right away I think of just extraction. Historically, when we look at any emerging or new technology, there's always a cost that is bared by very specific demographics in every transition. So when I hear the word AI, I think extraction. When I hear the word AI, some hear opportunity. I hear human rights due diligence. When I hear the word AI, I hear human rights and energy transitions. I hear something different. So I definitely see on the horizon the remarkable potential of this emerging technology. But my challenge has always been around emerging technologies, the socialization of risk, but the privatization of reward. I always tell my colleagues that are in as Black entrepreneurs in the private equity or the VC space or emerging fund managers that are deploying catalytic capital to founders in the tech space that I don't know if I feel comfortable figuring out a way to get our kick at the can of capitalism. And when I say that, I mean, yes, historically underrepresented and marginalized demographics, especially in technology, have not been able to build as many unicorns as other races and cultures. But the fact remains that I know that, yes, capitalism has raised many people out of poverty. But the fact remains, if every vulnerable and distinct group or every oppressed group on the nation wants their turn at capitalism, we're going to have a really terrible legacy that we leave for our grandchildren. So I'm interested in finding ways and means to ensure that we walk along the tech leaders that understand justice, access, inclusion, diversity, decolonization, equity. I'm looking forward to walking on a journey with AI innovators that are solving problems that actually need to be solved, or pervasive social issues that change makers, thought leaders, practitioners across a plethora of systemic challenges are really looking at from a different lens now that we have technology that can actually aid us in solving these problems. So I have the same amount of anxiety and trepidation I have around this new technology. I also have hope and some optimism. But once again, I believe there's a lot of work to be done because for me, just a profiteering gluttony that has consistently happened with every emerging technology in the Western world and the fallouts that has always fallen on specifically the global South isn't by accident. It's very intentional and it's very consistent. And as a student of history, as someone that understands pattern recognition, I feel like we have an opportunity this time to do things differently, even though I think we're already down a very dangerous path.
I want to touch upon on the topic of inclusion and of course thinking about AI, but like and also just so that people are more exposed to who you are, and even like I look at your background right now, and there's like indigenous art, I would say. I don't know what it is, but it seems to me.
I didn't
Uh,
consider
and
it.
and and then when you speak, and I just heard you speak, I heard you write about like ancestral knowledge and the importance of ancestral knowledge. When I look at you, Victor, I see the word inclusivity actually express in your life because you're thinking, we need to integrate ancestral knowledge, we need to integrate so many different wide perspectives, we need to have a wide array of contexts in order to be actually to be able to be a contributor in this space. So when I think about AI, I also think about how necessary it is to touch on all those things and make sure that all of those areas that are not prioritized, because often there's an inclination towards a commercialization mindset, and commercialization will only benefit a few. It's kind of designed that way. So what are the things that need to actually be in place in order to ensure that a certain default direction is not just led to be that way, because that is only going to lead to potential downside of harm, because some of the work that you've done in the past, which is like working with youth and ensuring that working with all groups of people. And then, so I guess you have a reflection or a reply on the importance more so now than even before within your work to actually be very focused about what we need to do to ensure that everything that happens around AI is inclusive at its core. And then maybe a side question, if I can add, is like, why is is it so hard to grasp this concept for other leaders? Because obviously we want to make more victors in the life, but also we cannot expect so much of you, right? You're a father of four, you're already living in a country that's 4 or 5 hours difference to Canada, and so you have so many complications so much that we can't just ask to be doing all the work. So what can we do also to enable more leaders to actually understand these things that are so crucial?
Yeah, so Toronto, Canada is home. Born and raised in Scarborough, East Toronto. I've worked in international development for easily 15 years. Zimbabwe, Zambia, Ethiopia, Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, Barbados, Jamaica, St. Lucia, but born and raised in Toronto, Canada. I don't think the world needs more victors. I definitely think that we need to find ways and means to understand the distinction between an inequality, equity, equality, and justice. So let me contextualize that. A lot of my work early days was working with young people coming out of incarceration. I worked in every correctional facility there is in Ontario. I was working specifically around meeting the needs to mitigate recidivism. Recidivism being folks going back into custody. And when I looked at the challenges that these young people faced, there was always a social economic lens to it. So when I say that, I mean whether it be housing, educational attainment, substance abuse, mental health, regardless of the situation, there's a social economic lens. Hence the reason why myself and my colleagues came together to found SETSI. We're tired of pulling our bodies to the bottom of the river. We wanted to go upstream in terms of policy, legislation, to figure out how can we change or develop solidarity economies. So when we think about the word inequality, it's unequal access to opportunities. So then folks will strive for equity, but equity just means that you're creating custom tools that identify and address inequality. Equality is evenly distributed tools and assistance, but justice is fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. The reason why I really want to hone in on that is because when we think about artificial intelligence currently, does everyone have equality, equity, or justice? Absolutely not. There's folks living in spaces where they don't have equitable access to internet. There's folks living in spaces where the data centers are going to literally drain the water and degrade the soil and like really give agriculturists a hard time. So I'll say that in the context of AI, we already see that there are folks starting on third base in the stadium, if we use a baseball kind of framing or lens, and there's folks outside the stadium. So we already know that there is a lack of justice within the AI ecosystem. My lens and the work that I'm trying to do and the work that my colleagues are trying to do is to share that the pie doesn't get smaller if you add more diverse representation to the various tables that are making decisions. The various tables that are making decisions as it relates to artificial intelligence, as it relates to the deployment of responsible and ethical AI, need to be diverse. Folks with lived experience, folks from different regions, folks from different backgrounds, races, creeds, orientations. That intersectionality is so important, and I'm not seeing it happen in a way that makes sense for people, place, planets. So, to answer your question, I really feel that we really have to hold folks' feet to the fire. Like, we have to engage Minister Evan Solomon in Toronto Centre and say, sir, you have to do better. Deploying a task force with a lack of representation that does not look like the diversity of Canada is a problem. When I think about the love that my father has for Canada, he came to Canada in the 70s with $60 in his pockets. He was a flight attendant for BWIA Airlines. For Christmas, they gave him a trip to Germany or Canada. He chose Canada. My father loves Canada. The difference between my father's experience with Canada and mine is I was assaulted by Toronto Police Services at the age of 13 in Kingston, Galloway. My father and I have so the idea of Canada I love, but the lived experience and lived reality of Canada is a very different model that I've experienced. 33 of my friends died due to gun violence just in Scarborough before I even hit the tender age of 27. They're gone. They're dead. I didn't grow up in a war-torn country. I grew up in Canada, land of milk and honey, yet 33 of my friends were murdered due to gun violence before the age of 27. I was stabbed in my chest at the corner of Kennedy and Lawrence. Almost died, 4 millimeters from my heart, if it wasn't for a jogger passing by that was able to literally call the ambulance on my behalf. So my lived experience in Canada is one of systemic and structural racism. We seeing that systemic and structural racism playing out in the context of AI is dangerous. It's dangerous in the context of the development of the LLMs, the large language models. It's dangerous when we think about the leaders in the private sector that are generating tons of capital through valuations that actually don't really even make sense, because some of them are getting pre-seed capital from the VC and private equity space, and the valuations are multiples that don't actually make sense in terms of business principles around EBITDA. More importantly, when we have decision makers, politicians, and parliamentarians that are building out tables for actionable insights that don't reflect the lived experience of all Canadians, I think we're in trouble, because that's a reflection of what's happening globally in terms of some of the private sector boards that are being constructed and developed as well. So the place that we are at as a species, knowing that capital markets are literally terminating us as a species, knowing that the responsible banking, capital markets, and global asset management departments of the financial institutions across Canada, the US, the UK, and many spaces are full tilt investing in extractive mining frameworks with a lack of human rights due diligence. We know that human rights and energy transitions and ESG and greenwashing, impact washing is almost the order of the day. We have to resist. We have to have some form of warrior scholarship activism, where folks that we know that are empowered with, that are articulate, that are empowered with knowledge around sectors and ecosystems, that understand that there needs to be not just greater justice, access, inclusion, diversity, decolonization, equity. We want to create spaces of belonging. That's literally what we require. But to create belonging, you require humility, empathy, compassion, and it cannot be based on a capitalistic system derived from colonial constructs and birthed from imperialism. We have to revisit how we structure all elements of these ventures, initiatives, projects, opportunities from the federal, provincial, municipal governments, from the private sector, from the philanthropic sector. And we also have to look at where the money is going, how capital flows, who capital flows to. I'm a dark-skinned, 6 foot, 250-pound Black man. Since the day I was born, I did not have the complexion for connection in almost in any room I was ever in. I've always had to work twice, 3 times, 5 times as hard to get access to similar opportunities as other folks within my cohorts. Regardless of that, I recognize that there is a privilege I have. And when I say that, I mean I am able-bodied, I have sound mind, I have the ability to work as many hours as I need to. I have an incredible family. So there's no time where I'm trying to create myself as a victim or perpetuating a villain. I'm not trying to create shame or blame. What I am trying to highlight in this conversation is the technology that we've unlocked as a species gives us an opportunity to either level a playing field or create the greatest wealth gap we have ever seen.
And as we're talking about, like I work a lot in digital equity internationally in Canada, when we're talking about the timing and how important it is to make sure that that gap doesn't turn into a chasm, whether we're talking about wealth or other things. When you talk about lived experience and context and how important it is, both on the challenges, like we recognize that even as late as during COVID, the oxygen readers for blood was not tested on non-white skin enough, so that non-white skin was 1.8 times less likely to detect COVID. That's a matter of life and death. But if we're looking at even the opportunities, and I don't know if either of you followed, like over a decade ago, Amazon was trying to do the local drone deliveries, and they were trying to do same day or 2 hour deliveries, like crazy things within urban settings in North America. That technology has turned into a way to use drone deliveries in on the African continent for medical supplies, for blood in remote areas. But that context, and the reason why I'm mentioning it, that won't be unlocked by people in Silicon Valley. So when we're talking about lived experience and context and why that's important, Silicon Valley technologists, whether or not we talk about techno solutionists or not, will not know local context. They will not know the opportunities. And to the point that you're making about people feel like if we're looking to widen the table, have more perspectives, that it's a pie that's becoming less. Not only is the pie getting bigger, but it's becoming tastier or more robust if we're looking at trust and relationships and social cohesion. That if we're looking at south of the border, for example, it's completely broken. But my question to you is, these aren't technology issues. These aren't capital flow issues. They are, but there are symptom of root issues related to the need to shed ego and to be humble, to look at reciprocity, to understand culture and mindset. Because you were talking about really eloquently, and I love that you wanted to go upstream. For me, the shedding of ego and the culture and mindset and the humility and reciprocity are the root causes. How do we go about changing that? Because we know that this technology is transformative. How do we change the culture and mindset so that leaders that, regardless what sector, regardless what discipline, understand that the pie will actually get bigger, tastier, more robust?
Yeah, I agree completely. I actually sometimes believe that the views even get, as the table gets bigger, the views get better. I think of a quote that my colleague shared with me once, and he was talking about privilege isn't about what you've gone through, it's about what you haven't had to go through. And I think in this time right now, we're in a time that's calling us to learn the stories that we don't know. So to shed ego, we have to just look at our privilege. And we have to really unpack what intersectionality really means. Like, intersectionality is about race, ethnicity, gender, class, language, religion, sexuality, mental health, age, education, attractiveness. There's so many different components to intersectionality. And I think that if we look at some of the leaders that are leading in the AI space, I don't see their egos shifting anytime soon. And I also don't see the young people coming out of these accelerators that are getting tons of capital thrown at them, their ego not being expanded. We saw what happened with the young woman that was building Theranos years ago, and her teachers telling her this couldn't be done. Like, capitalism, and once again, this is not me coming with any socialist ideals, but capitalism at its roots is about ego. It's about it's about self. And one of the greatest, and right now, I believe that we've already approached the wealth chasm. There's so many names that I could drop right now in this conversation of the billionaire 1% class on the planets. These individuals are so full of ego right now, they're buying up every single media company on the planets. From Paramount to Warner Brothers to Netflix to TikTok to X, the list goes on. Why would and this is not a new paradigm. In Canada, there are lots of leaders that bought up lots of newspapers. In Australia, there are a lot of leaders that bought up newspapers across the UK and across the US and build networks. So why do wealthy people rife with ego that are sometimes fueled by emergent technology, from the printing press all the way to Gutenberg to right now to Henry Ford, why do they want to control the media? Why do they want to control the narrative? So I don't see us changing these people's ego. What I do believe, I believe in the power of resistance. It is us. Like, Martin Luther King had a quote that I love. He said, "The moral arc of a universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And when we think about that construct, it took thousands, if not millions, of African Canadians, 300 million people in Africa. It took millions of African Canadians to do bus boycotts, to literally like resist oppression, to create a movement. And I feel like a lot of times we're so comfortable with our Wi-Fi, our smartphones, our flat screens, and our microwaves that we don't realize that we actually have individual power. And that individual power to divest from tools, divest from platforms, divest from systems collectively and consistently can actually move things. So for me, it's not really about changing the ego of the up and coming billionaires. I think my son just showed me a platform called Poly Markets. This young man is 27. He was minted as the youngest new billionaire in the world. He's 27 years old. There's no way if you give a 27-year-old $2 billion with a $13 billion valuation, he's not going to have some level of ego. Like, it's impossible. So but I believe that through our work diligently, working with academic institutions, building out cohorts of leaders that understand that there should be some form of commitment to the earth that we live on, some form of commitment to each other as human beings. Like, I don't think we can go upstream around this. I think the folks that have already attained their billions through capitalistic constructs are going to do what they're going to do. And we've always had those peoples going all the way back to the Gilded Age, the JP Morgans, the Carnegies, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers. There's always been people that have hoarded mass amounts of wealth and accumulated wealth that, like, I don't see that changing anytime soon. But what I think we can do in this era is mobilize much quicker and faster using technology. There's been so many movements around the planet that were developed across the global south and the global north with limited technology, with limited access to transportation, access to technology, access to communication. Right now, we have the ability to communicate across borders, across continents, at the speed of light. If we can't use that technology for good, if we can't use that technology for social impact, it begs the question, what kind of leaders are we? Like, are we working as hard as we should be? Because there has to be some form of countervailing force to this level of greed, narcissism, ego, and profiteering gluttony that we see consistently. And this is not a new paradigm within the human constructs. But I believe that we were in an era where we can now teach folks that there are ways that we organize our economic relationships since time immemorial that did not harm people and planets. Like, we have done this before. And just to be clear, a lot of times there's this like weird assumption that this system is just so unrelenting and so big. These systems are babies. If you look at the nation states and the companies and corporations that are running the planet right now, they're all less than a couple hundred years old. These are not 1,000-year-old civil. Like, if you look at the span of human history, these corporations, companies, and even countries are babies. The United States is not an old country. Canada's not an old. These are not the behemoths that cannot be shifted and tilted. My beloved elder and brother, David LePage from Bisocial Canada, we worked for years on changing policy with the federal government around a simple procurement piece, shifting the language from cheapest price to best value. That simple policy shift on a federal level opened up so many doors and opportunities for businesses on the margins of the periphery of the economy. There are so many wins that we have been able to pull off. My beloved brother, Lee Ben Abakar, the CEO of Reimagining Labs and the founder of the Foundation for Black Communities, has built a $250 million Black-led philanthropic endowment fund. I have elders like Dr. Sharona Hall, Dr. Charmaine Marine, Dudley Lodge, Charles Roach, that'd be rolling in their graves if they knew the amount of capital within the Black community. They would never have believed that there would be even a $10 million philanthropic foundation, let alone $250 million. If you look at the work of Tiffany Callender at FACE, Elder Craig Wellington at BOF, your work, Alex, and your work, Norm, there's system change, there's positive things happening, but I think that we have to keep our foot on the gas. We can't allow ignorance and apathy, the I don't know and I don't care, that sometimes is so intrinsic to the masses of folks that we deal with to get into our cipher. We have to figure out ways and means to maintain momentum and really push and resist. Because the Minister Evan Solomons of the world, I don't believe are nefarious. They want to do the right thing, but sometimes they're limited by their Rolodex. Sometimes they're limited by the folks that they know in the ecosystem. I don't think that the pan-Canadian AI strategy wants to have limited Black and Indigenous leaders. I think, once again, limited by their Rolodex. We need round tables, community consultations, key informant interviews, podcasts like this one, building out media outlets, developing position papers, publications. We need to keep our foot on the gas. We have to resist, and we have to have a certain level of activism, like it's life or death, because for some it is. If you go to the DRC right now, there are 6 and 7-year-olds mining lithium, cobalt, and coltan for your phones right now in Canada, for the laptops you're using, for the EVs and the data centers to build the $500 billion or $500 billion project Stargates. So this is about life and death, and we have to treat it as such.
I like to thank you, Victor. That was awesome. I want to share a reflection in a way of sharing something personal, which is going to lead into hopefully another great reflection from you, I'm sure. But as you both know, I'm Latino, I'm South American, I'm also indigenous from Peru. And I've seen in my country how being indigenous means to be mistreated, to think of as less. The media participates in this, creates a narrative to portray the indigenous peoples of Peru this way. And so there's a real push to sideline in Peru alternative perspectives, such as thinking about ancestral knowledge and actually talk about ancestral knowledge. Even though, because you said, ancestral means what? That is not new, right? Ancestral comes hundreds, thousands of years, as you said. This is a big difference. So we are in need of these views, especially now. We need to be thinking about different ways of seeing and relating to this world. Instead, what happens is, of course, the opposite. And indigenous perspectives are often excluded, and as I'm talking about Peru, but I think it's also happening here. And there's also, on top of that, in Peru, widespread racism, right? Like, to be indigenous is to be less. So you're going to be racialized. But right now in Peru, there's actually a 30-day long state of emergency. And many indigenous groups are actually part of this opposition of the government's actions. Because of this, they're even more targeted than they were before. So it's another level. So anyways, due to all of this, even myself, like I didn't think of myself as indigenous until just a few years ago. And it's all because there is this whole, dynamic that I had to live with. So anyways, this is leading me to see your reflection about this perhaps tension and fear that there exists to include indigenous perspectives, for example, because at least the way I'm seeing some such things, I think some of these perspectives are actually are seen as a threat and not as an opportunity, right? And the threat is, if we think about EDI concepts, that's more work. If you think about safety on AI, that's more work. If you think about the environment and being sustainable, that's probably more money and more work. And so we're thinking on this concept of a race. So to me, when I think about what perspectives are getting missed, as you were saying, I think a lot of that is by design, that these perspectives I don't want to be accepted simply because they're a threat to the way things have been working so far, which of course need to get changed. So I don't know. Yes, so I'm sure you have a perspective on this, but I feel like to recap, what we're dealing with is seeing perspectives that could actually be way better, can be proven to be way better than what we have right now, but not accepted simply because, hey, that threatens my lifestyle of being super rich and this and that and powerful.
Absolutely. So when I think about African cosmology, whether it be in Ghana, Akkad, or whether it be in Nigeria, Yoruba, or Ifa traditions, or Sangoma in South Africa, regardless of what area in the 5 regions across Africa or the 6 regions, historically unique groups across the Black diaspora globally, there's 3 sentiments that's reign true across the board. We honor and revere our ancestors, those who transition. We honor and revere the living, and we honor and revere the unborn. So our ancestors, the living, and the unborn. In this context around artificial intelligence, the way we honor our ancestors is by doing what they did. Our ancestors did not believe in ownership the way this current imperialistic, colonial, and capitalistic society believes in ownership. We were stewards of the land. So if you steward land and don't own, then that means that you protect and defend the soil. And that means that extractive mining frameworks would not exist the way they do today. If you steward the water and you become a water defender, like our ancestors did since time immemorial across almost every race, class, culture, creed, once again, you would not be using the water the way the water is required for some of these data centers. Remember, the challenge that we face is what we're calling innovation is actually laziness and stupidity. The technology that's being built right now and the way it's going about harming the environment is not innovation. A lot of people believe it's innovation. It's not. It's capitalistic and it's lazy and it's foolish. Because our grandchildren are going to look back and say, this is how you wanted to create energy? Do fossil, like this made sense to y'all? So once again, our ancestors, the living and the unborn. Now we have a duty to the unborn. Our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, those are coming behind us. And that duty that we have to them is to say, what stance did you take in the time and the era when these large multinational corporations were destroying the seeds, the soil, the land, the water, the air, and almost every form of environmental degradation possible in the pursuit of fiat currency, money not backed by any gold? Where did you stand? Were you on the side of these multinational corporations? Were you on the side of these governments that are horribly inefficient and sometimes operate completely immorally and completely unethically as it relates to people and planets? Or were you on the side of those freedom fighters and those liberation leaders that said, no, enough is enough? Hoarding this amount of capital is wrong. Doesn't matter how you frame free market activity or how you frame globalization, or how ambitious your ego has created you to be. So for me, when I think about indigenous ways of being, knowing, and learning, I think about just that cosmology framework. The unborn, the living, and our ancestors. And that piece around ownership and stewarding land and soil and the environments. I think another piece that's really important in this conversation, from the lens, once again, of artificial intelligence, is once we reach AGI, or maybe we have already, or let's say we reach artificial superintelligence, will artificial superintelligence think that these billionaires and profiteering gluttons are actually intelligent based off the way that they've gone about designing ASI? Like that's what's going to be fascinating to me. Because I don't believe that a super intelligence would look at an individual that's hoarded billions, or look at the first trillionaire on the planet as intelligent if 2/3 of the planet is living in poverty. I think that artificial super intelligence would look at that person as immature, naive, and potentially evil. So I really think that when we think about right and wrong, when we think about ethics and morality, or just moral sentiments in general, I think a lot of times we skew it to fit our worldview and our perspective and our lived experience, as opposed to looking at it from a global perspective. Because when we look at ethics and morality from a global lens, you have to look at the fact that there are certain nation states and continents that are drastically more wasteful than others. You have to look at the fact that there are certain nation states that are drastically more extractive in terms of their mining footprint across the planet. It's just data. It's black and white. And there's no way that artificial superintelligence would not be able to consolidate that data and make informed decisions that any rational human being that is literate could make.
I think you're right, and it's interesting that you mentioned that because I don't know if you've seen Musk, this a very public battle with Grok 4, where he's running into repeated issues with it being too woke, and that the fact that he says I need to basically rewrite history to make it less woke, but he's having that challenge because it's trained on society. It's trained on society, and while we have a ton of issues, if you fundamentally look at whether or not we talking about society or an environment, planet, if you have a collective opinion on what's good for the whole, then if it's trained on that, even if it's a mirror that has severe biases in it, I think you're right. Uh, I want to. There's so many topics that we can touch upon. We definitely need a second episode. But when you're talking about capitalism and ego, even the wording that we're using around chasing unicorns, rather than, I don't know if you know, you've heard the difference about the unicorns versus zebras. Unicorns being profit motivated, whereas zebras being more holistic and focused on community well-being. Getting away from that we're chasing the single rather than the whole. But I want to touch upon some of the other things that you talked about, the seeking to take over media to control, whether that be democracy, politics, a combination of everything, and the loss of social cohesion, because we've talked recently about the loss of local media and how much that is a loss for local, not only trust and relationships, but democracy. And we are working on, for example, the participatory governance hubs to look at power dynamics within public engagement and efficacy in democracy. I think that Canada has a strong potential. Yes, it's small, but if we're looking at events like All In, that I have a lot of criticism for, specifically tied to the gatekeeping of the pricing model. There's no inclusion in terms of a sliding pricing scale or anything like that. Huge issue. But when we get there, it's an event that's led by researchers. And fundamentally, I think that's the difference between the Canadian AI ecosystem that is very strong on the AI research institutes, that yes, they're in ivory towers currently, that we didn't build the bridges between that and the nonprofit or community sector. but the values alignment is much closer to being holistic there than in the Silicon Valley, so the corporate dominated AI space in the US, for example. But even though we can lead, how do we, and we have conditions, whether or not we're talking about indigenous knowledge, looking at OCAP care principles in regards to data sovereignty, or leading through our diversity and diaspora and recognizing, and I learned, since we've worked on affordable housing together as well, what knowledge can come through that diversity and diaspora, for example. And I'm going to mispronounce his name, but during one of your events, Kisito Musa Bimana brought one of the most elegant solutions for affordable apartment buildings in Canada through really reimagining it through his conversation or his knowledge from Rwanda, reimagining the apartment building like a village, big communal kitchen, intergenerational dialogue. And I think that's where our strength lies if it's unlocked. But how do we get to that point? How do we recognize that? To your point, I don't believe Evan Solomon. I think he is fundamentally values. I think there's a lot of techno solutions that are. But how do we build those bridges? Like, how do we build the bridges so that they're robust, whether it's across disciplines, across sectors, across regions? And I'm a big believer that we can't do that in the abstract. We need tangible. Where do we start? Like, where do we start? Because to your point, we're talking about a limited amount of time before we are looking our children and grandchildren in the eyes and saying, like, did we do enough? Like, what are the nails and the boards going into the bridge today so that we build those bridges strong enough for the future?
Yeah, those are great questions. In terms of the unicorn and the zebra piece, one of the biggest gripes I have right now, once again, is different vulnerable distinct groups getting their kick at the can of capitalism. I don't believe that we should be striving as a community, and have this conversation with Black fund managers all the time, to get, so we need to get a $300 or $500 million exit on the books in Canada, or we need to have our first Black unicorn. The reason why I say so is because what's the community benefit agreement associated with that? So if a Black-led tech firm, and remember, when you look at the Black capital continuum in Canada, it's very straightforward. Nano grants are through micro loans, the Black Opportunities Fund, ACBN, Alterna, Futurepreneur, and then between $10,000, $25,000, $250,000, you have the remarkable work of FACE, and there's a capital gap between $250,000 and $750,000. And then to actually be a founder, to access any money over $250,000, you have to be tech enabled. That's through BKR. My piece is, if we get a Black company that has a $300, $400, $500 million valuation, or we get a Black unicorn, that Black unicorn most likely receives scaffolding and support from ISED, ESDC, essentially the public purse, BDC, the list goes on. So what is that founder's obligation now to the Black community? What is that founder's obligation now to the Black founder ecosystem? Or do they take their millions and go to Silicon Valley, or billions and go to Silicon Valley? So I believe that there needs to be almost like a framework around like an exit pledge. So when you talk about like boards and like practical things, I feel like if you are a Black founder in Canada and you receive capital from the public purse or scaffolding from the public purse, and you do an exit, there should be a pledge of certain amount of shares back into the ecosystem or back into community. And that's something that I've been pushing for a few years now, with some pushback, because once again, some folks are like, it's been 400 years, it's our turn at capitalism. I disagree completely. In terms of the All-In conference, I believe that conference needs to be boycotted by Black people. I believe that conference needs to be boycotted by Indigenous people. I think that the challenge that we face in Canada, once again, is a lot of Canadian AI researchers went through that cold winter for so long where they got zero funding. So now the corporate's configuration and construct in the States has floated capital to these researchers and these corporate products type AI folks for quite some time, through Y Combinator and all these accelerators for a very long time. But Canada went through just this AI deep freeze where they weren't getting capital, and now over the past 5 years, money's flowing. So these folks feel so entitled as postdocs and researchers to not share those resources that challenges groupthink. You cannot innovate if you all look the same. You cannot innovate if you all think the same. You cannot innovate if you all have the same lived experience. So I believe, from my perspective, that we need fearless leaders within racialized, underrepresented communities to literally boycott these convenings and say, until you develop, I don't want to be the token one representative from one of these think tanks to be on a panel. I don't want to be a token one performative leader in a room of 500. I don't want to be the one person that's able to get advisory contracts and consulting contracts to advance an all-white ecosystem. And until we have those type of fearless leaders that are literally willing to put their career on the line, we're in trouble. And we've had people in the past who have been willing to put their lives on the line. So putting a job on the line should be nothing. But once again, not everyone is built the same. And once again, we can't call on people to do things that they're not comfortable to do. But the fact remains that I am not interested in incremental, performative, tokenistic representation in the AI space when I know with certainty, without the Black diaspora, without Africans globally, there is no AI. Literally, it doesn't exist. People of African descent are needed for these data centers. The minerals from the continents are needed for every element of this work. And if you look at Canada's global mining footprint, you'll recognize how deep and how entrenched it is. In terms of the piece around media, I think we need to look at
Yeah, and just to add, as we're closing into the podcast, I'm just going to share one more thing, and just closing off. Wanted to touch a little bit on your Victor as the person, amazing person that you are, and I know, like, just with our interactions, it's that I always notice that you always ask about the family. How is the family doing? And then I know family has been central for you. Is your North Star social impact leader, somebody who thinks so holistically about community. Just focus on that concept of thinking about the family, right? And it's how you just bring inclusivity. It's just an example of the way that you bring inclusivity into your work. Because often somebody who's very busy and who has leadership roles, or who's an executive, etc., focuses on their work, and it's like my work, but it's not my family. So, but you find a way to connect the two, which I think is a very clear sign of the holistic vision in every action, thinking about being inclusive. So building up on that and thinking about family, and you have spoken about this concept of the unborn, right? Which is like thinking about the new generations. In Indigenous beliefs, we're always talking about intergenerational perspective, long term. Can you just have a perspective about like just centering on your identification with family, thinking about the unborn, just to close, just to get your perspective on how do you angle yourself from that perspective?
I think that's an amazing closing point, and I just want to reference a few different topics that we would love to explore in a second episode, but because I think there's so much rich insight and topics here, and really powerful one, and really important and some tough. Everything ranging from capital flows and transparency needed there, and obviously we've touched upon it some, but going into detail about the extractive nature of not only data practices but mineral, and really maybe even diving even deeper into what are starting places that are starting to think through mining practices that can be community oriented, for example. Like there are ways to do things the right way and to support a new type of innovation that you're clearly and accurately calling out. The nature of potentially public banks and community-oriented funding mechanisms. And people may be surprised when they're listening to this and how much we're trying to talk about funding and capital flows. But when we're talking about a technology that's integrated into everything, how important it is for us to call out and bring transparency into capital flows that are underpinning often mismatches on one side, but inequities on another. And then just really closing in on what you just mentioned. You're talking about your own family, but you're obviously also referencing the family as a whole and relationality, not just between us, but to also obviously the planet. But I work really closely with Vanessa Andreotti that's looking at relationality in technology. Right now, we have a cold relationship with technology. We need to build that same relationality with technology, otherwise it will not be a good partner. So I'll leave it to Norman to close off, but really appreciate your time, your insights, wisdom.
Yes, Victor, we should have you again. And yeah, we could go for many hours of covering topics and stuff. But yeah, I just want to close again, just thanking you. And is there anything you would like to share or highlight for anybody as we post this podcast? Thank you, and thank you, everybody.